The storm didn't just arrive in Bitter Creek. It exploded. One moment, the sky was a bruised purple. The next, it was torn open, spitting rain sideways, so hard it felt like handfuls of gravel thrown against the pines. The thunder wasn't a rumble. It was a crack, like the world itself was breaking apart at the seams. And through that chaos, she rode. Her name was Elena Marlowe, and she was riding a stallion as black as a closed coffin, a beast she called Shadow. She urged him on, her body low against his neck, a single desperate silhouette against the raging dark. Her riding skirt, short and practical, was soaked through, plastered to her skin, revealing the powerful curve of her thighs as she gripped the saddle. Her hair, a long, wild mane of brown, was whipped across her face by the wind, sticking to her cheeks. But it couldn't hide her eyes. They were the color of a stormy sky themselves, gray and burning with a fire that defied the cold rain. Lightning split the sky, a brilliant, terrifying flash, and for just a second, it illuminated the dagger strapped to her thigh. The handle wasn't plain wood or leather. It was carved, intricate, the bone handle gleaming white against her tan skin. It looked less like a tool and more like a relic, something that held a story of its own, a promise, or maybe a curse. She didn't look back. She couldn't afford to, because behind her, through the roar of the storm, she could hear them. Hoofbeats, faint but steady, gaining on her. They were hunting her, and the past was so close she could feel its claws on her heels. If you looked closely at the sleeve of her blouse, you'd see it. A stain, faint and rusty brown, almost lost in the wet fabric. It was the only evidence of what she'd fled, a silent testament to the violence that had sent her running into the teeth of the storm. Up ahead, a single light flickered, a tiny pinprick of orange in an overwhelming sea of black and gray. The cabin of Jonas Hale, a man who had come to Bitter Creek to be forgotten, a man who had built walls of solitude around a heart shattered by grief, a man who had sworn off the world and all the trouble that came with it. He had no idea she was coming. He had no idea the storm he was hiding from outside was nothing compared to the one about to knock on his door. Would he turn her away? This woman who seemed to be carved from the very essence of the storm itself? Or would she be the one thing that could finally break through the walls he'd spent years building? The question hung in the air, as heavy as the thunder, and the hoofbeats behind her were getting closer. Jonas Hale sat alone in his cabin, a fortress of rough-hewn cedar built to keep the world out. The storm was a monster clawing at the walls, the wind howling like a ghost with a grievance. But Jonas didn't notice. His world had shrunk to the block of pine in his hands and the small razor-sharp knife he was using to carve it. Each slice was deliberate, controlled, shaving away a piece of the wood, shaving away a piece of the world, shaving away the memories. On the table next to him, a small, dusty picture frame lay face down. He never turned it over. He didn't need to. The image was burned into his mind, and looking at it was a pain he no longer allowed himself to feel. His eyes, the color of hard green ice, were focused, empty. This solitude was a penance, a prison he had built for himself after his life was stolen from him. A bounty hunter's mistake, they called it. His wife and son, caught in the crossfire of a job gone wrong. But to Jonas, it wasn't a mistake. It was a failure. His failure. And he'd been paying for it ever since. No one came to his cabin. The trail was too rough, the woods too deep. He'd made sure of that. So when the knock came, it wasn't just a sound, it was a violation. It was loud, frantic, almost as violent as the thunder itself. Instantly, the man carving wood was gone. In his place was the man he used to be, the bounty hunter. His grip tightened on the carving knife, his knuckles white. His body went rigid, his senses flaring, tasting the air, listening past the storm. He moved to the door, silent as a predator, and cracked it open just an inch. The wind and rain spat into the room, cold and angry, and there she stood, Elena Marlowe, soaked to the bone, shivering, her body trembling under the assault of the storm. Her riding skirt was molded to her legs, the wet fabric clinging to every line, every curve. Her long brown hair was a mess of wet strands, framing a face that was both fierce and desperate. And her gray eyes burned with a light that seemed to cut right through him. Please, she rasped, her voice rough and broken. Her lips were pale, trembling from the cold, or maybe from fear. Just, just until the storm passes, every instinct in Jonas's body screamed at him to slam the door, to shut her out, to keep his carefully constructed peace from being shattered by this wild, beautiful mess of a woman. Trouble didn't just follow her, it clung to her like the rain. He could see it, smell it, but then her breath hitched, a small involuntary shudder running through her. And he saw something else in her gaze, past the defiance. He saw a rawness, a spirit that had been bent but refused to break, and it found a crack in the ice around his heart. He didn't say a word. He just stepped aside, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. She slipped past him into the warmth of the cabin. Her shoulder brushed his chest as she passed, and a jolt, a spark of heat shot through him. It was a feeling so foreign, so long forgotten, that it felt like a brand. She went straight to the hearth, standing before the fire, wringing the water from her hair. Droplets hissed as they hit the hot stones. The thin fabric of her blouse, now nearly transparent from the rain, clung to the swell of her breasts and the gentle curve of her waist. Jonas felt a tightening in his gut and quickly turned away, his movements suddenly clumsy as he busied himself with the kettle. Her presence was a physical weight in the small cabin. It was heavy, suffocating. It was everything he had run from. "Don't touch anything," he growled, his voice like gravel scraping against stone. She gave a small, quick nod, but as she moved around the small space, her fingers grazed the table, hovering for just a second over the face-down picture frame. His reaction was instant, primal. His hands shot out, snatching the frame away before she could even think about touching it. "I said, don't touch anything." The words were sharp, a wall of ice thrown up between them. Her head snapped up, and the desperation in her eyes was replaced by a flash of steel. Her chin lifted. "You always this kind to strangers who are half drowned?" "Never had one show up before," he shot back, his voice harsh. But his eyes betrayed him. For a split second, his gaze dropped to her lips, full and still glistening from the rain. He saw the way they parted slightly, the way a quick breath passed through them, and he felt that heat again, coiling low in his belly. Cursing himself, he turned back to the fire, needing to put his back to her, needing to pretend the sudden heat in the room was only coming from the flames. The storm didn't break. For days it held Bitter Creek in its relentless, watery grip. The rain was a constant drumming on the cedar roof, a sound that became the rhythm of their confinement. The cabin, once Jonas's sanctuary, now felt like a cage he was sharing with a wild thing he didn't understand. Elena stayed. She didn't press him, didn't ask questions. She moved with a quiet, restless energy, as if staying still was a physical pain. She tended to her horse, Shadow, with a gentle, practiced hand. She tried to make herself useful, mending a broken saddle strap with hands that were surprisingly clumsy with a needle and thread. She even tried to bake bread, and when she pulled a blackened, smoking brick from the small oven, she didn't curse. She laughed. It was a soft, unguarded sound, and it hit Jonas with the force of a physical blow. He felt his own mouth twitch at the corner, a ghost of a smile, a traitorous reaction that he immediately suppressed. The sound of laughter had been absent from this cabin for a very, very long time. He found himself showing her how to properly knot the leather strap, his calloused, rough fingers brushing against hers. Her skin was soft, warm, and the contact sent another one of those jolts through him. He pulled his hand back as if he'd touched a hot coal, but she didn't flinch. She just watched him, her breath catching for a fraction of a second. Her gray eyes were searching his face, looking for something he wasn't sure he still had, something he damn sure wasn't ready to give. The days bled into nights, tense, silent nights, filled only with the roar of the storm and the crackle of the fire. The unspoken things between them filled the small space, making the air thick and hard to breathe. One night she found an old worn book on his shelf. It was a book of poetry from his former life, a life with his wife. He hadn't touched it in years. He'd forgotten it was even there. She sat by the fire, the light flickering across her face, and she began to read aloud. Her voice was low and steady, a gentle current in the storm of silence he lived in. She read a line about love lost, about memories that haunt the living like ghosts. The words were a knife in his gut. They stirred the ghosts he worked so hard to keep buried. The ghost of his wife's laughter, the ghost of his son's small hand in his. He wanted to scream at her, to tell her to shut up, to stop digging up the graves he had so carefully filled. But he couldn't. Her voice was weaving something around him, something soft and warm, but incredibly dangerous. It was pulling him toward the edge of a cliff he had sworn he would never go near again. "Stop," he said. The word was meant to be a roar, but it came out as a choked whisper. He was gripping his carving knife so hard his knuckles were bone white. She looked up, closing the book but keeping her fingers on the worn leather cover. "You keep it," she said, her voice soft. "But you don't read it." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. She saw right through him. Her gaze held his, bold and unnervingly gentle, and for a terrifying moment, the cabin felt impossibly small. The air was too thick, charged with something he couldn't name. He had to get away from her, from those eyes. He stood abruptly and turned to the window, staring out into the black, rain-streaked darkness. The storm outside was a perfect mirror for the chaos she had unleashed inside him. She was a stranger. She was danger. She was a risk he couldn't afford. But her presence in his desolate world was like a single candle lit in a vast, dark cavern, and he couldn't bring himself to snuff it out. He was drawn to the flame, even knowing with absolute certainty that it would burn him. The storm raged on, and the walls of the cabin seemed to close in a little more each day. Elena was a constant, unavoidable presence in Jonas's small world. She was a shadow he couldn't shake, a quiet challenge to the empty peace he had mistaken for living. He'd watch her from the corner of his eye. He watched her haul water from the creek, the muscles in her back flexing under her thin blouse. He watched the way her hips swayed with the weight of the buckets, a natural, unconscious rhythm that made his own breath catch in his throat. He'd turn away quickly, grabbing his carving knife, slicing into the pine with a ferocity that did nothing to quell the hunger stirring deep inside him. He had sworn off wanting. He had buried desire alongside his wife and son. But this woman was digging him up, one shovelful of earth at a time. One morning, a brief lull in the rain allowed them to venture outside to repair a section of fence that had been smashed by a falling branch. The air was cold, biting. Her hair, tied back loosely, broke free in the wind. She reached up to tuck a stray strand behind her ear, and as she did, her sleeve pulled back, revealing a faint, silvery scar that cut across the delicate skin of her wrist. It was thin, old, but deliberate. Not an accident. Jonas's eyes locked onto it. A question burned in his mind. A question about the past she kept so hidden. He didn't ask. He never asked. But she caught him looking. She saw the question in his eyes. Her lips parted, her breath a small white cloud in the cold air. A ghost of a smile touched her mouth, a sad, knowing little thing. "You look at me like I'm trouble," she said, her voice low, a teasing challenge. Her gray eyes dared him. "Because you are," he replied, his voice a low rumble. He stepped closer, reaching for the fence post to steady it while she worked the wire. His arm brushed against her side, and the warmth of her body seeped through his thick flannel shirt, a jolt of pure electricity. She didn't pull away. She leaned into the touch ever so slightly, her gaze locked with his, bold and searching, as if she could see past the grizzled ex-bounty hunter, past the grief, to the man he had been. The man he thought was long dead. His pulse hammered against his ribs. The space between them crackled. He had to move. He had to get away. "Gotta check the horses," he muttered, turning and striding away, retreating from the magnetic pull of her nearness, from the terrifying possibility of feeling something again. He didn't look back, but he could feel her eyes on him the entire way. That night was different. The unspoken tension that had been simmering between them finally reached a boiling point. The fire cast flickering shadows that danced on the cabin walls, making the small space feel even more intimate, more charged. Elena sat closer to him than usual, stirring the glowing coals with a poker. Her knee was just barely grazing his thigh. She had unbuttoned the top two buttons of her blouse from the day's work, and as she leaned forward, the fabric gaped open, revealing the soft upper curve of her breast, her skin glowing like honey in the firelight. Jonas's throat went dry. His fingers, calloused and rough, itched with a sudden, overwhelming urge to reach out and trace the line of her collarbone, to feel the warmth of her skin. He felt like he was suffocating. He reached for the poker to take it from her, a clumsy excuse to do something. Their hands brushed. His rough, hers impossibly smooth. A spark, a tiny shock of static electricity, arced between them, and it was enough to stop his breath. She didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she leaned closer. Her scent, rain and leather and something else, something uniquely her, flooded his senses, intoxicating him. Her lips, full and soft, were inches from his. He could feel the warmth of her breath on his skin. His hand, of its own accord, moved to her waist, his fingers spreading over the curve of her hip. He wanted to pull her onto his lap, to crush his mouth to hers, to surrender completely to the raw, desperate heat that was building between them, a fire far hotter than the one in the hearth. Her own fingers came up, grazing his jawline, a touch so soft it was almost not there, but it sent a tremor through his entire body. He leaned in, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The world narrowed to the space between their lips, and that's when he saw it. Over her shoulder, in the corner of the room, a glint of reflected firelight off something small and dusty on a shelf. A child's shoe, worn, scuffed, tiny, his son's shoe. A ghost of laughter echoed in his memory, sharp and clear and agonizing. The image of his wife's smiling face flashed behind his eyes. Guilt crashed over him like an icy tidal wave, extinguishing the fire, drowning the desire. He was betraying them. He was letting this woman, this stranger, make him forget. He jerked back as if he'd been burned, his chest heaving. "You don't belong here," he rasped, the words torn from his throat. They were meant for her, but they were for him too. A desperate, painful reminder of the vows he'd made to his ghosts. Her eyes flashed, first with hurt, then with a hard, protective shell of steel. "Maybe I don't," she said, her voice tight. She stood up, her silhouette a sharp, defiant shape against the fire. "But I'm here now." Before he could find the words to answer, a sound split the night. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't the wind. It was a sharp, deliberate thwack. Close by. Too close. In a heartbeat, Jonas was on his feet, the grieving husband gone, the bounty hunter in full command. He snatched his rifle from its pegs on the wall, the familiar weight of it a cold comfort in his hands. He moved to the window, peering out into the rain-swept darkness. And he saw it. Stuck deep into the corral post, not 20 yards from the cabin, was a knife. A long, ugly-looking blade, gleaming wetly in the faint light from the window. And tied around its handle was a piece of cloth, a handkerchief bearing a crudely drawn brand, a horseshoe. He heard a sharp intake of breath behind him. He turned. Elena's face was as white as a sheet. All the color had drained from it, leaving her eyes wide and dark in the firelight. Her hand wasn't at her side. It was clutching the carved bone handle of the dagger at her thigh, her knuckles stark white. "They found me," she whispered. The words were almost soundless, but they hit the silence of the cabin like a gunshot. Her voice was steady but laced with a terror that was bone deep. "Who?" Jonas demanded, his own past roaring back to life. The rifle felt heavier now, not just a tool but a burden. She finally looked at him, and her eyes were haunted by ghosts of their own. "Colt Maddox," she said, the name like poison on her tongue. "I ran from his gang. I took something from him, something he wants back. He won't stop. He'll never stop." Jonas's blood ran cold. He knew that name. He knew that brand. Colt Maddox, a ruthless killer, a ghost from his own bounty hunting days. A man he had chased across 3 territories but had never been able to catch. A man known for his cruelty, for leaving a trail of bodies wherever he went. The storm wasn't the only thing closing in on them anymore. The cabin, once his sanctuary, now felt like a trap. And Elena, with her danger and her secrets and the impossible heat she stirred in him, was the bait. He worked the lever on the rifle, checking the chamber. The metallic schlick-schlack was a comfortingly familiar sound. He looked at her, his green eyes meeting her gray ones over the barrel of the gun. A silent vow passed between them in the charged darkness. Whatever was coming, he wasn't going to run from it. Not this time. The cabin held its breath. The air inside was sharp, thin, vibrating with a tension that felt like a drawn bowstring. Jonas stood by the window, the rifle a permanent extension of his arms, his eyes scanning the dripping black morass of the forest. The knife in the post was a promise of violence. Colt Maddox was out there, somewhere in the dark, circling like a wolf. Elena was no longer the frightened woman who had collapsed on his doorstep. She sat by the fire, but she wasn't still. She was disassembling her dagger, cleaning the blade with a piece of oilcloth, her movements efficient and practiced. The blade was long, perfectly balanced, with a wicked, serrated edge near the hilt. It was a killer's weapon. She looked up and caught him watching her. "They'll come at dawn," she said. Her voice was low, flat, certain. "Colt likes to watch the sun rise on his work." Jonas just nodded. The bounty hunter in him knew she was right. Colt wasn't the type to wait. He was the type to save her. "You should have told me who was chasing you," he said, his voice a low growl. The anger was there, but it was tangled up with something else, something that felt dangerously like concern. "I didn't want your blood on my hands," she replied, her voice just as quiet. She rose and walked towards him, stopping so close he could feel the warmth radiating from her body. Her fingers, soft and hesitant, brushed the hard muscle of his arm. The touch was fleeting, but it seared his skin through the thick flannel. "You've got enough ghosts in this cabin already, Jonas." Her words hit their mark, a clean shot straight to the heart. She saw him. She saw the pain he tried so hard to hide. She saw the ghosts he lived with every single day. He wanted to push her away, to rebuild the wall she had so effortlessly torn down, but he couldn't move. Her gray eyes held him captive, raw and fearless. The fire crackled, spitting a shower of sparks. The sound broke the spell. He reached out, his hand moving on its own, and his rough, calloused fingers grazed her cheek. Her skin was impossibly soft. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut for just a second. A silent surrender. His other hand found her waist, sliding around her, pulling her flush against him. The soft curves of her body molded against the hard planes of his. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling her scent. Rain and smoke and woman. It was a scent of life, a scent that chased away the stale air of death and grief that filled his home. Her fingers curled into the front of his shirt, her nails grazing his chest. A low groan escaped his throat, a sound of pure, helpless need. He was lost, drowning in her. Her lips were a breath away from his. He tilted her chin up with his thumb, ready to finally close the distance, to taste her, to forget everything but the feeling of her in his arms. And that's when he saw it. Again. The face-down picture frame on the table. It seemed to gleam in the firelight, mocking him, his wife, his son. Their faces screamed at him from beneath the wood, accusing him of forgetting, of betraying their memory. He froze. The heat vanished, replaced by a familiar, soul-crushing wave of guilt. He tore himself away from her, stumbling back a step, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "I can't," he rasped, the words sounding like they were being ripped from his soul. "I can't do this." It was a plea, a desperate cry from a man chained to his past. Elena's eyes, which had been soft and yielding moments before, hardened. The hurt was there, a flicker of pain, but it was quickly overshadowed by a fierce, unshakable resolve. "Then keep me alive," she said, her voice dropping, becoming as hard and sharp as the blade of her dagger. "Just keep me alive until morning." But the truth was, Jonas wasn't just thinking about keeping her alive. He was thinking about the name, Colt Maddox, and he was remembering a piece of his past he had tried to forget, the bounty that had killed his family. It had been an anonymous posting, but there were whispers, rumors of a ruthless operator who paid top dollar in untraceable gold to eliminate his rivals. An operator who used a horseshoe as his calling card. He had dismissed the rumors back then. He'd been too consumed by grief to chase shadows. But now the shadow had a name and it was standing right outside his door. He wasn't just protecting a stranger anymore. He was standing on the edge of a reckoning he never knew was coming. The man who had destroyed his life was out there in the dark, and the woman who had brought him here, was she just a victim, or was she something more? The question chilled him to the bone. Dawn didn't break. It seeped into the sky, a miserable gray wash that did little to push back the darkness. The rain hadn't stopped, turning the ground around the cabin into a thick, sucking mud. It was a perfect morning for a killing. Shadows detached themselves from the deeper shadows of the trees, 4 of them, moving with a practiced, predatory silence. Colt's men, circling, closing the net. Jonas was a statue at the window, the rifle butt pressed firmly into his shoulder. His breathing was slow even. The grief was gone. The confusion was gone. All that was left was the cold, efficient calculus of the hunt. Elena was at the other window, a heavy Winchester rifle in her hands. He'd been surprised by how naturally she held it, how her hands moved with a familiarity that spoke of long practice. There were 1,000 questions he wanted to ask her, but there was no time. The first shot came without warning. It wasn't aimed at them. It was aimed at the door, a loud, violent splintering of wood that was meant to intimidate, to announce their arrival. Jonas didn't flinch. He fired back. A single, clean shot. One of the shadows crumpled and fell face first into the mud. No sound, no cry, just a life extinguished. The bounty hunter was awake, and he was very, very good at his job. He knew staying in the cabin was a death sentence. It was a box, a trap. "Cover me," he grunted. Before she could answer, he was out the back door, a fleeting shadow moving low and fast. He used the terrain he knew so well, the rocks, the creek bed, the thick stands of pine, as his weapon. He drew the fire of 2 of Colt's men, letting them chase him, leading them away from the cabin, into his world. A bullet screamed past his ear, close enough to feel the heat. Another one tore through the fleshy part of his shoulder, a sudden, searing pain. Blood soaked his shirt, hot and sticky. He gritted his teeth, ignoring it, dropping to one knee behind a granite boulder. He waited. 1 beat, 2 beats. He rose, fired twice in rapid succession. 2 more bodies hit the mud. He stumbled back towards the cabin, the world tilting slightly. Elena was there, pulling him inside, her face a pale mask of fear and fury. "You idiot!" she hissed, her hands shaking as she tore his sleeve to get to the wound. "You reckless, stubborn idiot!" Her fingers probed the wound, her touch surprisingly gentle for all her anger. She worked quickly, packing the wound with a clean cloth, her eyes fierce with a concentration that went deeper than just fear. He could feel the warmth of her breath on his cheek, could feel the curve of her hip pressing against his side as she leaned over him. "Stay alive, Jonas," she whispered, the words a fierce command, a prayer. She grabbed the Winchester and took his place at the window, her body taut, ready. And Jonas watched her. He watched the way she sighted down the barrel, the way her shoulders were set. She wasn't a frightened woman anymore. She was a soldier. And that's when Colt Maddox himself stepped out from behind the trees. He wasn't like his men. He moved with an arrogant swagger, a long duster coat whipping around him in the wind. He held a pistol in each hand, casually, as if they were toys. His face, visible even through the gloom and the rain, was twisted into a cruel, possessive smirk. Elena saw him, and she froze. The rifle wavered in her hands. Her breath hitched. Jonas saw a flicker in her eyes, not just fear, but a dark, haunted memory, the memory of captivity, the memory of his twisted obsession with her. Colt's voice cut through the sound of the storm, impossibly loud, impossibly clear. "You're mine, Elena," he bellowed, his voice filled with a sickening certainty. "You always were. You belong to me." Jonas struggled to his feet, his shoulders screaming in protest, his rifle heavy in his hands. The cabin was a cage, the storm was a shroud, and Colt Maddox was the devil himself, come to collect his due. Elena's finger was on the trigger. Her heart was a battlefield, a war raging between the terror of her past and the defiant spark of her will to be free. Her eyes met Jonas's. 1,000 words passed between them in that one silent glance. A vow, a promise. He would fight for her. He would die for her, even if it meant facing down the man who had already taken everything from him once before. But then Colt Maddox laughed, a chilling, ugly sound. "Did you tell him, my love?" he shouted, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Did you tell your new protector about the part you played? Did you tell him how you were the one who gave me the information? The information about the bounty on that worthless rancher? The one that got his wife and kid killed?" The world stopped. The rain, the wind, the pain in his shoulder. It all vanished. All that existed was Colt's voice and the words that were hitting him like bullets. He turned his head, slowly, to look at Elena. Her face was shattered. It was a mask of pure horror and guilt. Her lips were moving, but no sound was coming out. Tears were streaming down her face, mixing with the rain on the window pane. She hadn't just brought the storm to his door. She was the storm. She was the mistake. She was the beginning of his end. And now she had come back to finish the job. The betrayal was so absolute, so complete, that it felt like his heart was being physically torn from his chest. The man who had destroyed his life was outside, and the woman who had helped him do it was standing right beside him. The rain hammered down on the cedar roof, each drop a nail in a coffin. Jonas's world had been reduced to a single, echoing moment of betrayal. Colt's words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous, twisting everything he thought he knew. He looked at Elena, really looked at her, and he didn't see the woman who had laughed at burnt bread or read poetry by the fire. He saw a ghost, a harbinger of his own personal apocalypse. Her face was a canvas of agony. "Jonas," she breathed, the word a shattered plea. "It wasn't. I didn't know. He told me it was an empty homestead, a message to a rival. I swear, I didn't know anyone was there." But her words were just noise. The truth, or what he perceived as the truth, was a roaring inferno in his mind, burning away everything else. He had let her in. He had let this woman, this accomplice to his family's murder, into his home, into his heart. He took a step back from her, the rifle in his hands feeling impossibly heavy. The urge to turn it on her, to erase the source of this new, unbearable pain, was a physical sickness in his gut. And in that moment of hesitation, that single fatal pause, Colt Maddox made his move. He wasn't aiming for Jonas. He was aiming for Elena. He knew. He knew that taking her would be a wound far deeper than any bullet. He fired. The shot was deafening inside the small cabin. Jonas saw it happen in slow motion. Elena's eyes widening, her body beginning to fall, and without thinking, without conscious thought, he moved. He threw himself in front of her, his body shielding hers. Pain exploded in his side, a white-hot, blinding agony that stole his breath and sent him crashing to the floor. The rifle clattered from his grasp. The world swam in a haze of red and black. Elena screamed his name, a raw, primal sound of pure horror. She dropped the Winchester and threw herself down beside him, her hands pressing against the new gushing wound in his side. "No, no, no," she chanted, her tears falling hot on his face. "Jonas, stay with me. Please stay with me." Through the fog of pain, he saw Colt and his last remaining man charging the cabin door. This was it. The end. He had failed again. He had let the monster win. But then something shifted in Elena. The terrified, guilt-ridden woman vanished. The grief on her face was forged into something else. Something hard. Something lethal. She snatched the carved bone dagger from the sheath on her thigh. She met his fading gaze, her gray eyes burning with a terrifying fire. "I will not let him take anything else from you," she vowed, her voice low and trembling with rage. She stood up, a warrior queen rising from the ashes of her own making. The cabin door burst open, and Colt Maddox filled the frame, a triumphant, ugly sneer on his face. "It's over, my love," he said, raising his pistol. Elena didn't hesitate. She didn't flinch. She launched herself forward, not at Colt, but at the floor. She slid across the rough wooden planks, grabbing Jonas's fallen rifle. In one fluid, impossible motion, she rolled onto her back, aimed the rifle, and fired from the ground. The shot caught Colt's remaining henchman in the chest. He staggered back out the door, a look of complete surprise on his face before collapsing into the mud. Colt stared, momentarily stunned by the sheer ferocity of her attack. And that's all the time she needed. She was on her feet, the rifle in one hand, her dagger in the other. She was a vision of righteous fury, her face streaked with tears and Jonas's blood. "You're right, Colt," she snarled, her voice dripping with venom. "It's over." She fired the rifle. The bullet ripped through his gun hand, sending his pistol flying into the corner. He howled in pain, clutching his shattered hand. But Elena wasn't finished. She closed the distance between them in two long strides, the dagger held in a reverse grip. She moved with a brutal, terrifying grace, a whirlwind of vengeful violence. She ducked under his wild swing, drove her shoulder into his stomach, and slammed him back against the wall. The dagger came up, the point pressed hard against the soft flesh under his chin. "You took everything from him," she hissed, her face inches from his, her eyes blazing with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. "You used me to do it. You made me a monster. Now you get to meet one." Colt's eyes were wide with a fear he had never known. He had created this creature, and now it was going to unmake him. Lying on the floor, his life's blood pooling beneath him, Jonas watched. He watched this woman, this storm, this agent of his destruction, become his avenger. He realized in that moment that she hadn't been lying. The guilt on her face had been real. She hadn't known. She was a victim, too, a different kind of victim. A tool that had been used and discarded, and she was fighting for him. Fighting to reclaim not just her own life, but the honor of the one she had unwittingly helped to destroy. The fight was brutal, primal. Colt, even with one hand, was strong, but Elena was faster, fueled by years of pent-up rage and a desperate need for redemption. She was a whirlwind, her dagger a blur of motion. She wasn't trying to kill him. Not yet. She was dismantling him. A cut here, a slash there. Paying him back for every moment of fear, every ounce of pain he had ever caused. Finally, she drove him to his knees. He was bleeding from a dozen small cuts, his breath coming in ragged sobs. He was broken. She stood over him, her chest heaving, the dagger held ready. And in that moment, Jonas found his voice. "Elena," he rasped, "don't." She turned to look at him, her eyes wild. "He deserves to die," she said, her voice shaking. "I know," Jonas breathed, the effort costing him, "but not by your hand. Don't let him turn you into him. Don't let him win." Her gaze flickered from Colt's pathetic, pleading face to Jonas's, lying pale and bleeding on the floor. She saw the truth in his words. Killing Colt now wouldn't be justice. It would be a surrender to the darkness he had forced upon her. Her resolve hardened, but in a different way. She stepped back, the dagger still held ready. Her eyes never left Colt, but her next words were for Jonas. "The letter," she said, her voice tight. "The thing I stole from him. It wasn't from my mother. It's his ledger. Every crime, every name, every bounty. It's all in there, proof. Proof of who he paid to kill your family. It was the final piece, the key to everything." She reached inside her blouse and pulled out a small oilskin-wrapped packet. She tossed it onto Jonas's chest. "Justice, Jonas," she said, "not revenge." A new sound cut through the storm, the sound of more hoofbeats. But these were different. Organized, steady, a posse. The gunshots had finally drawn the attention of the law from the nearest town. Colt's face, already pale with fear, went white as a ghost. The ledger was a death sentence, and he knew it. Elena gave him one last look of utter contempt. Then she turned her back on him, kneeling beside Jonas, her focus entirely on him. "Hold on," she whispered, her hands already working to staunch the bleeding. "You are not allowed to die. I forbid it." As the lawmen stormed the cabin, they found a strange sight. A bleeding, broken man on his knees, a furious, blood-spattered woman tending to a gravely wounded hero, and a small, priceless packet of paper that would finally bring the justice Jonas Hale had stopped believing in. The rain finally stopped. The silence it left behind was profound, broken only by the dripping of water from the eaves of the cabin. The sky was a clean, washed-out gray, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine. It smelled of a new beginning. Jonas survived. It was a near thing, The town doctor said he'd never seen a man with that much grit. But Jonas knew it wasn't just grit. It was Elena. She had refused to leave his side, her fierce determination a shield against the encroaching darkness. She had willed him to live, and he had obeyed. Colt Maddox was gone, hauled away in chains by the federal marshals who had descended on Bitter Creek when they saw the contents of his ledger. His reign of terror was over. The names in that book, including the man who had taken Colt's money to carry out the hit on the rancher, would all face their own reckonings. Justice, slow and methodical, was finally grinding its gears. Jonas sat on the porch of his cabin, a thick bandage wrapped around his side. He was carving a new block of wood, not with the frantic, desperate energy of before, but with a slow, peaceful deliberation. He was carving a bird, a hawk with its wings spread wide, ready to take flight. Elena came and sat beside him on the steps. They didn't speak for a long time. They just watched the sun begin to break through the clouds, painting the wet landscape in strokes of golden orange. Finally, Jonas spoke, his voice still rough, but softer now. "I found that book of poetry," he said, not looking at her. "The one you were reading." She waited. "There's a line in there," he continued. "Some souls are built from the wreckage of a storm." He finally turned to look at her, his green eyes clear and full of a feeling he was no longer afraid to show. "I think that's us." She gave him a small, true smile. Not the sad, knowing ghost of a smile from before, but a real one. It transformed her face, chasing away the last of the shadows. "So what now?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Do we try to rebuild from the wreckage?" Jonas set down his carving. He reached over and took her hand, his rough, calloused fingers lacing through hers. Her skin was warm, and this time he didn't pull away. He held on, anchoring himself to her. "My wife and son, I spent so long trying to preserve their memory by locking myself away," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought that's what they would want, but I was wrong. They would want me to live. They would want me to find a reason to see the sunrise again." He squeezed her hand. "You are my reason, Elena. You are my sunrise after the storm." She leaned her head on his good shoulder, her hair tickling his neck. "I have nowhere else to be," she whispered. He turned his head and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. It wasn't a kiss of desperate passion or fiery need. It was a kiss of peace, of promise, of a future they would build together, not on the ashes of their past, but from the strong, weathered wood of its wreckage. Outside the cabin, her black stallion, Shadow, was tied next to a new mare Jonas had bought. They stood together, patient, waiting for the next journey. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. They were two scarred souls, two people who had seen the worst of the world. But they had found each other in the heart of the storm, and together they were finally, truly free. If this story of survival, justice, and redemption held you captive, do me a favor and hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And I have to ask, what do you think was the biggest turning point for Jonas? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. And of course, if you want more stories that dig into the dark and dangerous corners of the human heart, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next storm.